The humidity in Dallas during late June was always heavy, but today it felt like it was physically pressing against my chest. My name is Rachel, and for 68 years I have lived a life defined by the simple rhythm of service. I was a school teacher for 30 years, a wife for 40, and a mother for every second since the moment my son Henry was born. I spent the morning in my kitchen, the air thick with the sweet, tart scent of Granny Smith apples and cinnamon. I was baking an apple pie, Henry's favourite. It was a Sunday, the day we always had dinner together. I had the table set with the good lace cloth, the one my husband bought me for our silver anniversary before he passed away. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4 in the afternoon. Henry usually called by 3 to tell me he was on his way from his house in Highland Park. The silence in the house was the first thing that started to feel heavy. I checked my phone for the 10th time. No missed calls, no messages. No, I thought perhaps he was just busy with Jasmine, his wife. Jasmine was a beautiful woman, or at least she spent a lot of money to look that way. She was a lifestyle blogger, always occupied with her followers and her aesthetics. I tried to like her. I really did. When they got married 4 years ago, I gave them my entire savings, $200,000, to help them with the down payment on that beautiful white mansion. I told myself that a mother's job is to build the floor that her children walk on. By 6 o'clock, the apple pie was cold on the counter. The golden crust had begun to lose its luster. I dialed Henry's number. A mechanical female voice answered, informing me that the number I had dialed was no longer in service. I frowned, my heart skipping a beat. I tried Jasmine's number. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail. I felt a cold prickle of anxiety on the back of my neck. I grabbed my car keys and headed out to my old sedan. The drive to Highland Park usually took 20 minutes, but today every red light felt like an eternity. When I turned onto their street, my breath caught in my throat. The pristine white mansion, the one I had helped buy with my sweat and tears, looked different. There were no cars in the driveway. The manicured lawn was starting to look slightly overgrown at the edges. But it was the sign in the front yard that shattered my world. It was a metal sign from a real estate company, with a large red sticker across it that read, "Sold." I parked my car at the curb, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I walked up the driveway, my heels clicking hollowly on the concrete. I peered through the large front windows. The house was empty. The expensive Italian leather sofas were gone. The crystal chandelier that Jasmine insisted on was gone. Even the curtains had been stripped from the rods. It was a shell, a ghost of a home. I stood there, trembling in the Texas heat, feeling a sense of vertigo. I took out my phone again, my fingers shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I went to Jasmine's Instagram page. The most recent post had been uploaded 3 hours ago. It was a video of Henry and Jasmine on a private boat, the turquoise waters of the Maldives sparkling behind them. They were holding glasses of expensive champagne, laughing into the camera. The caption read, "Finally free from the weight of the past, new beginning in paradise." We forgot to mention we moved, but life is too short for long goodbyes. Maldives for the next 3 months. No phones, no stress, just us. The words blurred before my eyes. We forgot to mention we moved. It sounded so casual, as if they had simply forgotten to pick up a carton of milk from Kroger. They had sold their house, packed their entire lives, and flown across the world without a single word to the woman who had sacrificed everything to put them there. I felt a sob rise in my throat, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the empty walls of the mansion. I was 68 years old, and I had just realized that to my only son, I was a discarded piece of furniture. I drove back to my small house in a daze. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the darkness of my living room, the cold apple pie still sitting on the counter, a silent witness to my stupidity. I stayed there for hours, the silence of the house now feeling like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of abandonment. I wondered what I had done wrong. I had been a good mother. I had given him everything. I had lived on coupons and old clothes for years, just so he could go to the best private schools in Dallas. A week later, the true depth of the betrayal began to surface. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. I thought it might be Henry, calling to apologize, calling to tell me it was all a big misunderstanding. But the voice on the other end was cold, professional, and entirely devoid of mercy. It was a man from the First National Bank. "Mrs. Rachel Miller," he said, his voice clipped. "I am calling regarding the delinquent balance on the commercial loan for Miller Innovation Group. As the primary personal guarantor for this account, you are now responsible for the immediate payment of the outstanding balance." I blinked, pulling the phone away from my ear for a second to make sure I wasn't dreaming. "I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered. "I don't have a commercial loan. I'm a retired teacher." There was a pause, the sound of papers ruffling on the other end. "Mrs. Miller, you signed as the guarantor for your son, Henry Miller, 18 months ago. The loan was for $500,000. No payments have been made for the last 90 days. Since the primary borrower has vacated his residence and closed his known accounts, the bank is exercising its right to seek full repayment from the guarantor. $500,000. The number rang in my head like a funeral bell. "I never signed anything like that," I said, my voice rising in panic. "I helped him with his house, but I never signed for a business loan." The man's tone became even colder. "We have the notarized documents here, Mrs. Miller. Your signature, your social security number, and a copy of your Texas driver's license are all on file. If the balance of $500,000 is not settled within 30 days, we will begin the process of seizing your assets, including your primary residence." I hung up the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My house. My small, humble house that I had lived in for 40 years. It was all I had left. I ran to my desk, tearing through my old files, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I found a folder Henry had given me over a year ago. He had told me they were just some insurance papers for his new business venture. He had said, "Mum, I just need you to sign these to show you're my emergency contact. It's just red tape. You know how these banks are." I looked at the copies of the papers I had kept. My eyes caught the fine print that I had been too trusting to read back then. Commercial Loan Guarantee Agreement. There it was. My signature, bold and clear. But next to it, on the original bank documents, there was more. Henry had forged my initials on several pages. He had used my identity to secure a massive loan to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford, and then he had fled, leaving me to face the wolves. But the bank was only the beginning. 2 days later, there was a heavy knock on my front door. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor. It was a loud, rhythmic thud that made the wooden frame rattle. I went to the door, my hands trembling. Through the peephole, I saw 2 men. They were large, wearing dark suits that didn't quite hide the bulk of their muscles. They weren't from a bank. They didn't look like they cared about fine print. I opened the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice small. One of the men, a man with a thick neck and eyes as hard as pebbles, stepped forward. He didn't smile. He held up a piece of paper. "We're looking for Henry Miller. We heard he moved, but his mother still lives here. Henry owes our clients $80,000, high-interest private capital." I swallowed hard. the air in the doorway feeling suddenly frigid despite the Texas heat. "My son isn't here," I said. "I don't know where he is. He's out of the country." The man leaned in, his shadow falling over me, extinguishing the light in my hallway. "That's a shame," he said, his voice a low growl, "because Henry told us that if he couldn't pay, his mother would cover the debt. He said you have a very nice house here, lots of equity. He even gave us a copy of your deed." I felt a wave of nausea. Henry had given them my deed. He had used my home, the only place I felt safe, as collateral for a debt to people who looked like they broke bones for a living. I tried to close the door, but the man put a heavy boot in the way. $80,000, Mrs. Miller, the man said. "We don't do 30-day notices like the banks. We come back every week, and every week the interest goes up 10%. You might want to find a way to get that money. It would be a shame for such a nice lady to have an accident in her own driveway." He pulled his foot back and walked away, his partner following him. I slammed the door and locked every bolt, my body shaking so violently I had to slide down the wall and sit on the floor. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of ink. My son, the boy I had tucked in every night, the boy I had taught to be kind and honest, had turned me into a target. He had sold my safety for $80,000 of high-interest cash. Over the next few days, the reality of my situation became a suffocating weight. I was 68 years old, living on a fixed pension that barely covered my groceries and utilities. I had no way to pay $500,000 to the bank, let alone $80,000 to the monsters who were now stalking my home. I tried to go to the police, but the officer at the desk looked at the papers and sighed. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice pitying but helpless. "You signed these papers. It's a civil matter. As for the men at your door, unless they actually assault you or damage your property, there's not much we can do. You can file for a restraining order, but if they're private debt collectors, they'll just send someone else. You should probably talk to a lawyer." A lawyer? I didn't have money for a lawyer. I didn't have money for anything. My bank account had been frozen by the First National Bank as part of their recovery process. I had $42 in my purse and a cold apple pie in the fridge. That was the sum total of my life after 40 years of work. I walked through my house, touching the things I loved. The old oak table where Henry did his homework. The height marks on the pantry door where I measured him every year on his birthday. The photos of him as a toddler, smiling with his first bicycle. Every memory now felt like a drop of acid on my skin. I looked at the most recent photo of him, the one from his wedding day. He looked so happy, so successful. Beside him, Jasmine was beaming, her eyes already looking at the mansion they were about to buy with my money. I went into the kitchen and opened the pantry. It was nearly empty. I hadn't gone grocery shopping because I was afraid to spend the $42. I found a box of crackers and sat at the table, eating them slowly. The crickets outside were loud, their chirping sounding like a mockery of my silence. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest, a physical pain that felt like a bruise on my soul. This was the bottom. This was the place where a mother realizes her love was a one-way street that led to a cliff. The isolation was the hardest part. I called my best ban, Martha, who I had known since we were both young teachers. When I told her what happened, her voice was filled with shock, but then it became guarded. "Oh, Rachel," she said, "that's terrible. Truly." But I told my husband, and he's worried. He says we shouldn't get involved in financial legal battles. We're on a fixed income too, you know. We can't afford to be connected to something like that. I understood. They were afraid. My son had turned me into a pariah. I was a liability, a sinking ship that everyone wanted to distance themselves from. I stopped calling people. I stopped going outside. I stayed in my house with the curtains drawn, watching the shadows of the large men pass by my window every evening. The psychological toll was devastating. I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard Henry's voice calling for me. I would run to the door, only to find the empty street and the humid Dallas night. I started having vivid flashbacks of his childhood. I remembered when he was 6 and he fell off the monkey bars. I carried him 3 blocks to the clinic, my arms aching, my heart racing. He had looked at me with such trust, such pure, unadulterated love. He had said, "You're my hero, Mum." Where was that boy? How does a hero become an obstacle? How does a mother become a sacrificial lamb for a Maldives vacation? I would sit in his old bedroom, which I had kept exactly the same for years, and cry until my eyes were swollen shut. The room smelled of old books and childhood, a scent that now made me feel physically ill. I was grieving a son who was still alive, but who was more dead to me than my husband in the cemetery. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the discovery, I received a notification in the mail. It was a formal notice of eviction. Because of the delinquent commercial loan and the secondary debts, the house was being foreclosed on with an expedited timeline. I had 14 days to vacate the premises, 14 days to pack 40 years of my life and find a place to go with no money and no friends. I sat on my porch, the notice in my hand. I looked at the neighborhood I had lived in for so long. The children playing in the yard across the street, the neighbors walking their dogs. Everything was so normal for them. Their lives were intact. Their children weren't forging their signatures and leaving them to the loan sharks. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of resentment. Why me? Why was my devotion rewarded with this cruelty? I went back inside and turned on the small television I had in the kitchen. I shouldn't have looked, but I went to the social media app on the smart TV. Jasmine had posted a new reel. It was titled Living Our Best Life, Maldives Edition. The video showed them at a candlelit dinner on the beach. There were lobsters, fine wine, and a personal violinist playing in the background. Jasmine was wearing a diamond necklace I had never seen before. Henry was laughing, his arm around her, looking like the king of the world. The contrast was too much. I looked at my cracked crackers and my lukewarm tap water. I looked at the eviction notice on the table. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud break, but a quiet, cold realization. The grief, the confusion, the self-pity. They all started to drain away, replaced by a dark, icy pool of resentment. I had spent my life being a victim of my own love. I had let Henry consume my past, my present, and now he was trying to consume my future. I didn't eat that night. I didn't sleep. I sat in my husband's old leather armchair and watched the sun come up over the Dallas skyline. My mind was no longer spinning with why or how. It was starting to focus on what. What was I going to do? I looked at the photo of Henry on the mantel. For the first time, I didn't see my son. I saw a criminal. I saw a man who had stolen my dignity. I realized then that the only reason Henry and Jasmine were laughing in the Maldives was because they thought I was a harmless old woman. They thought I would just fade away, that I would move into some government-subsidized housing and die quietly of a broken heart, leaving them to enjoy their stolen luxury. They counted on my maternal instinct to protect him, even as he destroyed me. They counted on my silence. I stood up, my joints aching, my body weak from hunger, but my eyes were clear. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked old, yes. I looked tired. But there was a flicker of something in my eyes that hadn't been there for a long time. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. And in the United States of America, a person with nothing left to lose and the truth on their side is a very dangerous thing. I went to my closet and pulled out a small, dusty box from the top shelf. It contained the few things Henry hadn't found: my husband's old gold watch, a few pieces of jewelry from my mother, and a business card that was nearly 20 years old. The card was faded, the corners curled, but the name was still legible: Mr. Sterling. He had been my husband's lawyer and a close friend. They had served in the military together. I hadn't seen him since the funeral, but I remembered what he had told me then. Rachel, if you ever find yourself in a corner, you call me. Don't let your pride get in the way. I picked up the phone. My hand was steady now. I had 14 days before I was homeless. I had 8 days before the loan sharks came back with more than threats. And I had a lifetime of unspent maternal fury that was starting to boil into a cold, calculated rage. I dialed the number, praying that the man who represented the law and loyalty was still out there. Part one of this nightmare was over. I had been betrayed, humiliated, and discarded. I was at the very bottom of the U-curve. The house was dark. The power had been cut off that afternoon because I couldn't pay the bill, and the silence was absolute. But as I sat there in the Dallas heat, waiting for the phone to ring on the other end, I wasn't crying anymore. I was beginning to think like a predator. Henry had forgotten one thing about his mother. I was the one who taught him how to survive. And now, I was going to show him how a real expert does it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like a heartbeat. I held my breath, the darkness of the house closing in on me. I thought about the Maldives, the champagne, and the forged signatures. I thought about the loan sharks and the eviction notice. "Hello?" a deep, gravelly voice answered. "This is Sterling." "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice like cold iron. "This is Rachel Miller. I'm in a corner, and I'm ready to stop being a victim." There was a long pause on the other end. "Rachel," he said, his tone shifting from professional to concerned. "I've been reading the Highland Park real estate news. I was wondering when you'd call. Where are you?" "I'm in the dark," I replied, "but I'm finally starting to see everything clearly." "Good," Sterling said. "Stay exactly where you are. I'll be there in 30 minutes. And Rachel, bring every piece of paper that boy ever made you sign. We're going to work." I hung up the phone and sat back in the armchair. The transition had begun. The broken mother was dying, and a woman of cold purpose was being born in the shadows of a Dallas suburb. Henry and Jasmine were halfway across the world, celebrating their freedom. They had no idea that back in Texas, the ghost they thought they had buried was just getting started. I looked at the cold apple pie on the counter one last time. I walked over, picked it up, and threw it in the trash bin. I didn't need the sweetness of the past anymore. I needed the bitterness of the truth to fuel what was coming next. The descent was over. Now it was time to start the climb. The headlights of the heavy black SUV cut through the thick Dallas humidity, sweeping across the peeling paint of my front porch. I sat in the darkness of my living room, the silence finally broken by the low rumble of a powerful engine. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the lights. I had spent the last 3 hours sitting in that old leather chair, the eviction notice resting on my lap like a lead weight. I was no longer the woman who cried over a cold apple pie. That woman had died somewhere between the bank's cold phone call and the loan shark's heavy boot. My name is Rachel, and for the first time in my life, I was thinking about survival instead of sacrifice. The car door slammed. A moment later, a heavy, measured knock sounded on my door. It was different from the aggressive pounding of the debt collectors. This was the knock of a man who owned the space he walked in. I stood up, my knees stiff, and walked to the door. I pulled it open. Mr. Sterling stood there, his tall frame silhouetted against the streetlights. He was 70 years old, but he carried himself with the rigid discipline of the Marine he once was. He looked at the dark house, then at the suitcase by the door, and then finally at me. He didn't offer a hug or a platitude. He didn't say he was sorry for my loss. He looked at my face, searching for the traces of the broken woman he had seen at my husband's funeral. He found something else instead. "Rachel," he said, his voice as deep and steady as a mountain, "you look like you're ready to start a war." I stepped aside to let him in. "I don't have power," I said, my voice surprisingly clear. "They cut it off 4 hours ago." Sterling pulled a heavy flashlight from his pocket, the bright beam illuminating the stack of documents I had gathered on the oak table. "I didn't come here to talk about the electricity, Rachel. I came here because I owe your husband a debt that hasn't been paid." He sat down at the table, his presence filling the small kitchen. He didn't ask for water. He simply picked up the first document, the one Henry had made me sign, by telling me it was for insurance. I watched him read. His eyes moved with professional speed, scanning the legality and the loopholes. I sat across from him, my hands folded on the table. I had spent 40 years being a mother, but in this moment, I was a client. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I pushed it across the table toward him. Sterling didn't open it. "What is this, Rachel?" "It's my retainer," I said. "It's a 5-carat diamond ring. It was my mother's. It's worth at least $20,000 on the open market." "I know your hourly rate, Arthur. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for a contract. I need you to find every crack in the floor Henry and Jasmine are standing on. I need to know where the money came from, where it went, and how they think they can hide it from the federal government." Sterling finally picked up the box. He didn't open it. He just looked at me. "You realize that once we start this, there is no going back. He is your only child, Rachel. The law in this country is a meat grinder. It doesn't care about bloodlines once the ink is dry on a fraud charge." I looked at the empty space on the wall where Henry's graduation photo used to hang. "He stopped being my son when he used my deed as a bargaining chip for a loan shark," I replied. "He stopped being my son when he laughed in the Maldives while I was waiting for the power to be cut. I'm not his mother anymore, Arthur. I'm his creditor, and I want what is mine." Sterling nodded once. He put the box in his pocket. "Put your suitcase in the car," he said. "You can't stay here. The loan sharks know this address, and the bank will have a lock on that door by tomorrow afternoon. I have a secure apartment in downtown Dallas. It's owned by one of my holding companies. No one can track you there. We start the audit at 8 tomorrow morning." I didn't look back as I walked out of my home for the last time. I didn't look at the flower beds I had tended for decades, or the porch where Henry learned to ride his bicycle. I climbed into the SUV and stared straight ahead. The pragmatism had settled over me like a cold armor. I wasn't Rachel the teacher anymore. I was an architect of a reckoning. The apartment in downtown was sterile and modern. It was a world away from the soft, cluttered warmth of my suburban home. There were white walls, glass tables, and the constant hum of the city traffic below. Sterling had left me with a laptop and a stack of folders. He had also given me a burner phone and a credit card that was untraceable. "This is for your food and your transport," he had said. "Use it for nothing else." I spent the next 3 days in a fever of research. I had taught history for 30 years, and I knew how to find a thread and pull it until the whole tapestry unraveled. I spent hours on the laptop, scrolling through Jasmine's digital footprint. To the world, She was a success story, a woman of leisure and luxury, but to me, she was a trail of breadcrumbs. I found the funding for the Maldives trip. It didn't come from their Highland Park house sale. It came from a series of shell companies registered in Delaware under names that were variations of my husband's middle name. Henry was arrogant, but he wasn't original. He was using his father's legacy to fund his crimes. I found the transaction records for the $500,000 bank loan. The money hadn't gone into a business. It had been funneled through a cryptocurrency exchange into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The more I found, the colder I became. Every luxury Jasmine posted on her Instagram, the Chanel bags, the Rolex watches, the $500 brunches, it was all bought with the money that was supposed to be my retirement. They were literally eating my future. On the fourth day, Sterling returned. He brought a man with him. "This is Marcus," Sterling said. "He's a forensic accountant. He used to work for the Internal Revenue Service. He's been digging into Henry's tax returns for the last 3 years." Marcus opened a tablet and showed me a spreadsheet. It was a map of a disaster. "Mrs. Miller, your son hasn't paid a cent in federal income tax since 2021, he said. He's been reporting massive losses for his innovation group while living a multi-million-dollar lifestyle. That's a major red flag for the IRS. But it's not just the tax evasion. He's also involved in identity theft." My heart didn't even skip a beat. "Whose identity?" I asked. "Yours," Marcus said. "And your late husband's. He's been using your husband's social security number to open credit lines in Europe. He's been claiming his father is still alive and managing a trust fund. It's a massive case of federal wire fraud." Sterling looked at me, his eyes searching for a crack in my resolve. "Rachel, if we turn this over to the authorities, Henry will go to federal prison for a very long time. This isn't just a civil debt anymore. This is criminal." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the Dallas skyline. I thought about the men in the dark suits who had threatened me at my door. I thought about the 14-day eviction notice. I thought about the champagne glasses in the Maldives. "Do it," I said. "But not yet." Sterling frowned. "Why not?" "We have enough to bury him now." "Because burying him isn't enough," I said, turning back to face them. "I want him to feel the exact moment the ground disappears under his feet. I want him to be at the peak of his arrogance, in front of the people he cares about most, when the truth comes out. He thinks he's a player in the Dallas social scene. He thinks he's an elite investor. I want to wait until his Ramat boy tick for his new investment fund. I want the whole city to see what he really is." Sterling smiled then. It was a cold, sharp smile that matched my own. "The launch party is in 10 days at the Ritz-Carlton," he said. "Henry has been inviting the top tier of the Dallas business world. He's looking for $10 million in new capital. He's telling everyone his mother is in a high-end nursing home in Arizona, resting after a long illness." "A nursing home in Arizona?" I repeated. "He's already written the ending of my life. He's already buried me." "He thinks he has," Sterling said. "He hasn't checked his mail in Highland Park because he's too busy with the beach. He doesn't know the bank is already onto him. He doesn't know the IRS has been pinged. And he certainly doesn't know his mother is sitting in a glass tower downtown, planning his funeral." The next week was a blur of tactical preparation. I didn't spend my time crying or looking at old photos. I spent my time in a gym Sterling had access to. I needed to move with grace. I needed to look like a woman who had never known a day of poverty. I bought a new dress, a deep, midnight blue silk that cost more than I used to earn in 2 months. I paid for it with the money Sterling had recovered from one of Henry's smaller accounts. It was my money, after all. I went to a top-tier stylist. I had my hair cut into a sharp, sophisticated bob. I had my nails done. I had my skin treated. Every time the needle of the esthetician touched my skin, I thought about the loan shark's boot. Every time I felt the cold water of the swimming Mao, I thought about the Maldives. I was shedding the skin of the victim. I was becoming a weapon. I also spent hours with Mr. Sterling, practicing my delivery. We went over every detail of the legal packet we were preparing. We had the original forged documents. We had the forensic report from Marcus. We had the transaction records from the Cayman Islands. We even had a recording of the loan sharks threatening me at my door. A recording I had captured on my phone before the power was cut. Sterling was impressed. "You have a mind for strategy, Rachel," he said during one of our late-night sessions. "You should have been a lawyer." "I was a teacher, Arthur," I replied. "I spent 30 years managing a classroom of 30 teenagers. Dealing with Henry isn't that much different. You just have to know which student is the bully and how to take away their power." As the day of the party approached, a new level of pragmatism took hold of me. I realized that I wasn't doing this for revenge. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is hot. What I was doing was an audit. I was balancing the scales. Henry had taken my past and tried to steal my future. I was simply reclaiming the narrative. I checked Jasmine's Instagram one last time. They were back in Dallas, staying at a high-end penthouse while they waited for the launch party. She had posted a photo of the invitation. It was embossed in gold. The Miller Global Fund, a new era of innovation. The caption said, "So proud of my husband for his vision and his drive. We've worked so hard for this. Can't wait to see everyone at the Ritz." I looked at Henry in the photo. He was wearing a custom tuxedo, looking polished and confident. He looked like the man I had raised, but the eyes were different. They were the eyes of a predator who had forgotten that there are bigger things in the jungle. Sterling arrived at the apartment on the evening of the party. He was wearing his best tuxedo. He looked like a statesman. He handed me a small, elegant evening bag. Inside was the midnight blue silk dress and the legal packet, compressed into a slim silver flash drive. "Are you ready, Rachel?" he asked. I took a deep breath. I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone. The resentment was gone. There was only a cold, focused intent. "I am," I said. "Let's go to the Ritz." The drive to the hotel was quiet. The Dallas skyline was glittering with 1,000 lights, each one a symbol of the wealth Henry so desperately craved. We arrived at the Ritz-Carlton at 8 o'clock. The valet opened the door, and I stepped out onto the red carpet. I didn't feel like a 68-year-old widow. I felt like a force of nature. Sterling offered me his arm. We walked into the grand ballroom. The air was filled with the scent of expensive perfume, the clinking of crystal, and the murmur of the Dallas elite. I saw them immediately. Henry and Jasmine were standing in the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of investors. Henry was holding a glass of champagne, his face animated as he told a story about his time in the Maldives. Jasmine was beside him, her dress a glittering silver that reflected the light of the chandeliers. She looked like a star. She didn't look like a woman who had stolen a grandmother's retirement. We didn't approach them yet. We stayed on the periphery, watching the room. Sterling pointed out the key players. "That's the CEO of the First National Bank," he whispered. "And that man in the corner is a high-ranking official from the SEC. Henry invited them to show off. He doesn't realize he's invited the executioners to his own hanging." I watched Henry laugh. I watched him slap a man on the back. I watched the ease with which he moved through the room. It was the ease of a man who believed he had won. He thought I was in Arizona. He thought I was a ghost. The launch of the fund was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Henry walked onto the small stage at the front of the room. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight focused on him. He looked like a visionary. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice amplified by the professional sound system. "Thank you all for coming tonight. This fund, the Miller Global Innovation Group, is the culmination of years of hard work and a vision for a better future. It's about more than just profit. It's about building a legacy." I felt a cold sneer curl in my chest. A legacy built on my husband's stolen identity and my forged signature. I looked at Sterling. He gave me a subtle nod. It was time. I began to walk through the crowd. I didn't rush. I moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who knew exactly what was about to happen. People began to notice me. The murmurs started again, but they were different this time. "Who is she? Is that Henry's mother? I thought she was in Arizona." I reached the front of the stage just as Henry was reaching the climax of his speech. "And as for my mother," he said, his voice dripping with fake emotion, "I know she's watching from her care center in Arizona. She's the inspiration behind everything I do. She taught me that family is the most important thing." I stepped into the light of the stage. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was as if someone had sucked all the air out of the grand ballroom. Henry froze. The champagne glass in his hand trembled. The visionary mask didn't just crack, it shattered. "Hello, Henry," I said, my voice projecting through the silence without the need for a microphone. "I decided to leave Arizona early. It turns out the air in Dallas is much more clarifying for the truth." Jasmine, who was standing in the front row, let out a small, strangled gasp. Her eyes went wide with a terror she couldn't hide. Henry tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. "Mom," he managed to whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I'm here to audit your legacy, Henry," I said. "I'm here to talk about the fund. And I think these gentlemen would like to hear the details as much as I would." I looked back at Sterling. He stepped forward, the slim silver flash drive in his hand. He didn't look like a friend. He looked like a judge. The descent was over. The climb was done. We were at the peak of the U-curve now, and from this height, the view of Henry's world was about to become very, very dark. I stood there on the stage, the Dallas elite, watching with bated breath, and I felt a sense of profound autonomy. I wasn't Rachel the teacher. I wasn't Rachel the mother. I was Rachel, a woman of dignity and law, and the reckoning was just beginning. I looked at Henry, and for the first time in 35 years, I felt nothing but a cold, clinical curiosity. I wanted to see how he would handle the gravity of the law. I wanted to see how the predator would react when it realized it was the one being hunted. The launch party was about to become an investigation. The Maldives were a memory. Highland Park was a debt. And Henry was about to learn that the weight of the past isn't something you can just move away from. It's something that eventually catches up to you, especially when it has the truth and a midnight blue silk dress on its side. I stood my ground, my head high, and waited for the law to take its course. The transition was complete. The victim had become the architect. And in the silence of the Ritz-Carlton, the only sound was the ticking of a clock that Henry hadn't realized was counting down his final seconds of freedom. The truth wasn't just coming. It was here. And it was wearing my husband's mother's diamond ring on a chain around my neck, a reminder that loyalty isn't a debt you pay. It's a standard you live by. And Henry Miller was about to fail the final exam of his life. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. Sterling walked toward the podium, and I saw the security guards moving to the exits, not to let people out, but to keep the truth in. Henry took a step back, his face a mask of pale, sweating fear. Jasmine was frozen, her silver dress looking like a shroud in the spotlight. I didn't look at her. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at Henry. "It's over, Henry," I said softly, but the words carried to every corner of the room. "The audit has begun." I felt a wave of cold peace wash over me. I had survived the bottom of the U. I had climbed back up with a pragmatic heart and a legal shield. And now, I was ready to watch the world I had built for him fall apart, stone by stone, until only the truth remained. The silence that had fallen over the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was not the silence of respect, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a room full of people watching a train wreck in slow motion. I stood on the stage, the bright spotlight making the midnight blue silk of my dress shimmer like a deep ocean. Henry was frozen beside me, his face a pale, sweating mask of absolute disbelief. He looked at me, then at Mr. Sterling, and then at the circle of Dallas's most powerful investors, who were now watching him with the narrowed eyes of predators sensing a wound. Jasmine, standing in the front row, had her hand clamped over her mouth, her silver dress glittering as her chest heaved with panicked breath. Henry tried to swallow, his Adam's apple moving convulsively. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking and thin. "This is a private event. You aren't supposed to be here. You should be in Arizona. You're sick, remember? You're confused." I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to soothe his fear. I didn't feel the need to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. I felt a cold, clinical detachment. "I'm not confused, Henry," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the high-fidelity sound system of the ballroom. "I have never seen things more clearly than I do right now. I've spent the last 10 days with Arthur Sterling and Marcus, a former agent of the Internal Revenue Service. We've been having a very enlightening conversation about your vision for the future." Mr. Sterling stepped onto the stage, moving with the cold efficiency of a Marine captain. He didn't look at Henry. He looked at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Arthur Sterling," he announced. "I was a friend and business associate of Henry's late father. I am here tonight as the legal representative for Mrs. Rachel Miller. Before any of you sign a single check or commit a single dollar to the Miller Global Innovation Group, there is some due diligence that was omitted from the evening's presentation." Henry lunged forward, reaching for the microphone Sterling was holding. "This is harassment," he shouted, his voice high and shrill. "Arthur, you're a dinosaur. You're out of the game. Security, get these people out of here." Two security guards in crisp black suits moved toward the stage, but they stopped when a man in the back of the room stood up. He was wearing a plain, well-tailored suit and held up a leather badge. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," he said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "I am Special Agent Miller from the Securities and Exchange Commission. We've been monitoring this event for the last hour. Mr. Sterling, please proceed with the evidence." The room gasped as one. I watched the color completely drain from Henry's face. He looked like he was about to faint. Jasmine turned as if to run for the exit, but a woman in a similar suit blocked her path. Sterling didn't waste a second. He nodded to the tech booth at the back of the room. A moment later, the giant projector screen behind the stage flickered to life. Instead of the polished marketing slides Henry had been showing, it was replaced by a series of bank documents and forensic spreadsheets. On the left, the crowd saw the loan application for $500,000 from the First National Bank. On the right, Marcus had highlighted the forged signatures and the fake credentials Henry had created for me. Sterling pointed to the screen. "This is the foundation of Henry's fund," he said, "a loan secured through identity theft and the exploitation of a Goa foo." He has been using his mother's primary residence as collateral for a high-risk investment scheme that has already lost $300,000 in the Cayman Islands. The CEO of the First National Bank, who was sitting in the second row, stood up, his face reddening with fury. "Henry, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "You told me those initials were verified." Henry didn't answer. He was staring at the screen as the slide changed. The next document was a tax transcript from the Internal Revenue Service. It showed 3 years of zero reported income, while beside it, Marcus had placed a montage of Jasmine's Instagram posts. Photos of the Maldives trip, the Italian leather sofas, the 5-carat diamonds, and the luxury cars. "This is the lifestyle of a man who claims he has no income," Sterling said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "He has been funneling investor capital through a series of shell companies in Delaware, using his deceased father's social security number to open credit lines across Europe. This isn't innovation, ladies and gentlemen. This is a Ponzi scheme built on the bones of his own family." The room erupted. People began to stand up, shouting, demanding answers. Henry was backing away, his hands trembling so hard he dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the stage, the crystal pieces sparkling like the lies he had told. Jasmine was sobbing now, shouting at Henry from the floor. "You said it was safe," she shrieked. "You said the old woman was taken care of. You said she'd never find out." I looked down at her, the woman who had laughed in the Maldives while I sat in the dark. "You were right about one thing, Jasmine," I said, my voice echoing over her cries. "Life is too short for long goodbyes, but it's just long enough for the law to catch up." Henry turned to me, his eyes filled with a desperate, animalistic terror. "Mom, please," he begged, reaching for my hand. "You can't do this. I'm your son. We can fix this. I'll pay it all back. Just tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you gave me permission." I pulled my hand away, the midnight blue silk of my sleeve feeling like a barrier of cold ice. "I gave you my life, Henry," I said softly, so only he could hear. "I gave you my savings, my husband's legacy, and 35 years of devotion. And you used that love to put a loan shark at my door and an eviction notice on my lap. You didn't just steal my money. You tried to erase my existence." A special agent stepped onto the stage, followed by 2 Dallas police officers. "Henry Miller, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny," the agent said, his voice cold and final. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful sound I had heard in weeks. It was a sharp, metallic rhythm that signaled the end of the nightmare. Henry didn't resist. He collapsed into the arms of the officers, weeping like the child he had never truly outgrown. Jasmine was being led away as well, her silver dress looking dull and cheap under the harsh lights of the hotel. As they were being led through the crowd, Henry looked back at me. I expected to see remorse. I expected to see the son I loved. But all I saw was a hollow, empty man who had lost his audience. He looked at me with the same cold, calculating eyes he had used for his marketing slides. "You're going to die alone, Rachel," he spat, the venom returning to his voice even as the officers pulled him toward the door. "You're 68 years old, and you have nothing left." I stood my ground, my head high, my midnight blue dress making me look like a queen in the ruins of a kingdom. "I'm not alone, Henry," I replied. "I have my dignity, and unlike your fund, my dignity is something you can't forge." The ballroom cleared quickly after the arrests. The Dallas elite scattered like cockroaches in the light, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. Within 30 minutes, only Mr. Sterling, Marcus, and I remained in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. The silence was absolute now, but it was no longer heavy. It was the quiet of a house after a storm has passed. Sterling walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. We have a lot of work to do, Rachel, he said. The SEC will be managing the asset recovery, but with the evidence we've provided, we should be able to reclaim the Highland Park house and the funds in the Cayman Islands within 6 months. Your Dallas home is already being protected from foreclosure by a court order I filed this afternoon. I looked at him, and for the first time in 10 days, I felt a single tear roll down my cheek. Thank you, Arthur, I whispered. Don't thank me, he said, his eyes softening. You were the one who had the courage to step into the light. Your husband would be very proud of you. The aftermath of the reckoning was a blur of legal proceedings and financial audits. I spent the next several months in a small, quiet apartment in downtown Dallas, working with Sterling's team to untangle the web of Henry's crimes. It turned out the loan sharks were actually a group of small-time criminals Henry had met in a gambling ring in East Dallas. Once the FBI took Henry into custody, they were picked up within 72 hours. They were facing their own set of felony charges, and they would never bother me again. The bank loan was more complicated, but because Marcus had proven the forgery of my signature beyond a shadow of a doubt, the liability was shifted entirely to Henry's estate. The Highland Park mansion was sold at a luxury auction for $4 million. After the bank was repaid and the taxes were settled, there was a surplus of $1,200,000. According to the law of community property and the trust Sterling had established for me, that money was returned to my accounts. I was no longer a goer fou on a fixed pension. I was a woman of independent means. 6 months after the night at the Ritz, I found myself standing in front of my old home in the Dallas suburbs. The lawn was pristine again. The house was freshly painted, and the apple tree in the backyard was heavy with fruit. But I didn't go inside. I had sold the house 2 weeks prior to a young family with 3 small children. They needed the space more than I did. They would fill those halls with laughter and new memories, and I was happy to let the ghosts of my past finally rest. I moved into a small, elegant condo in Turtle Creek, overlooking the park. It was filled with light and air. There were no height marks on the pantry door. There were no old photos of a son who didn't exist anymore. I filled it with books, with music, and with the presence of new friends I had met through Mr. Sterling. Henry and Jasmine were sentenced a year after the arrest. Henry received 15 years in a federal penitentiary in West Texas for wire fraud and identity theft. Jasmine was sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy and tax evasion. I didn't go to the sentencing. I didn't need to see them one last time to know that the audit was complete. I simply received a phone call from Arthur and went back to my book. I spent my afternoons volunteering at a local community center, teaching English to immigrants. I found a new sense of purpose in the eyes of my students, people who had truly sacrificed everything to build a future in this country. I shared my story with them, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson in resilience. I told them that a mother's love is a powerful thing, but it must be guarded by self-respect. The physical pain in my chest, the heavy bruise on my soul, had finally healed into a faint, pale scar. I realized that the Maldives vacation Henry had taken with my money wasn't a destination. It was a symptom of a sickness I couldn't cure. By letting go of him, I had finally saved myself. One evening, I was sitting on my balcony, the Dallas skyline glowing orange and pink as the sun set over the Trinity River. I had a glass of wine in my hand, and the evening breeze was cool on my face. My phone buzzed on the glass table. It was an email from Mr. Sterling. The final assets from the Cayman accounts had been transferred. The case was officially closed. I took a sip of my wine and looked out at the city. I thought about the woman who had sat in the dark with $42 and a cold apple pie. I thought about the woman who had been afraid of the loan sharks. That woman felt like a stranger to me now. I was 69 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely autonomous. I realized that the U-curve of my life hadn't just brought me back to where I started. It had brought me to a place that was much higher. I had discovered a strength I didn't know I possessed. I had learned that the law is a tool, but Famjia is a choice. I had chosen to stop being a victim, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my husband's legacy and my own future. The humidity of the Dallas summer was still there, but it no longer felt like a weight. It felt like the warmth of a life that was finally mine to live. I was Rachel Miller, a woman of history, a woman of law, and a woman who had finally learned that the most important person to protect in any family is the one who holds the truth. The reckoning was over. The audit was done. And as the stars began to twinkle over the Texas plains, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. I was no longer a mother grieving a lost son. I was a woman celebrating a found self. It is a brutal yet powerful thing to realize that blood relation but does not guarantee genuine connection, worth, or loyalty. It is a hard truth, especially for a parent, but accepting that a person's actions define their character, not their lineage, is the key to personal freedom. The greatest takeaway from this experience is the immense value of active self-advocacy. I had to speak up, even when my voice was shaking, to activate the network of protection I didn't even know I possessed. The moment I chose to fight with the law as my shield, I transitioned from being a passive victim to an agent of my own rescue. It taught me that genuine family is an intentional construction, forged in the fires of mutual respect, not merely inherited by chance. The act of forgiving, even when the offender is unrepentant, is solely for the benefit of the person offering it. A crucial step in releasing the emotional chains that bind you to past pain and building an empowered future. True recovery is about reclaiming your narrative, finding joy and purpose in unexpected new beginnings, and realizing that your life is defined by the quality of the relationships you choose to cultivate, rather than the ones that abandoned you.